don't know how to answer you except to say that I teach you truths, my truths. Yeah, and it is kind of scary dealing with the truth. The man you arrested, did he confess?
Yes, sir. I believe he will.
Sidney Poitier was an irreplaceable icon in American cinema history, was the first black man to win an Oscar. A symbol of calm intellect and dignity. To the public, he was the face of conscience in a world filled with prejudice, but inside an abandoned house, where he had lived during his final years, a room was discovered that shook all those images to their core. On the worn-out wall were dozens of commemorative photographs, Poitier standing beside legendary names. But in nearly half of them, the faces next to him had been slashed out with a razor blade. One photo frame lay face down. Inside was a picture taken on the set of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. The co-star's face had been completely erased, and behind the photo, a message read, "They said they would never betray me, and then they did before I had the chance to walk away." What happened inside his abandoned home? How did his 6 children impact the legacy he left behind? And what was his true net worth at the time of his death? From a lifelong love story to heartbreaking details in his final days, this video will reveal hidden truths behind Poitier's remarkable life and untold struggles. Keep watching, because what we're about to uncover might surprise you. The burden behind the spotlight. Before becoming a historical icon, Sidney Poitier was just a poor boy born on Cat Island in the Bahamas, a place with no movie theaters and certainly no roles for black actors. His mother once brought him to a fortune teller, convinced Sidney wouldn't survive his first year of life. The woman looked at the frail, malnourished baby, then said, "He will go far, farther than any of you could ever imagine." That prophecy came true, but the price was steep. At age 15, Sidney left home for New York City with empty hands, a thick Creole accent, and almost no ability to read English. He was rejected by every stage he auditioned for because of his mispronunciations, because of his skin, and because his gaze was too sincere for the slave roles black actors were expected to play. But he did not give up. He washed dishes at night. By day, he read newspapers aloud to improve his speech. And when he finally stepped onto the stage, he wasn't just performing. He was challenging a culture that had forgotten black people could feel, could love, could think. In 1958, Sidney Poitier broke through with The Defiant Ones, earning an Oscar nomination, but it wasn't until 1963 that he made history with Lilies of the Field, becoming the first black actor to win Best Actor. He didn't just walk onto the stage. He opened the door for hundreds who came after him, from Denzel Washington to Viola Davis. However, along with that glory came an invisible burden. Sidney Poitier was not allowed to fail. He was not allowed to rebel. He was not allowed to be weak. The public needed a black hero who was patient and reassuring. Hollywood needed a safe face to market to white audiences. That loneliness ate at him for decades. In a private interview in 1977, he said, "I was the only black man in many rooms. They didn't hate me. but I always knew they feared what would happen if I changed even a little. He always kept his composure, always answered kindly, always wore a crisp suit, because if he lost his temper even once, they would say, "See, he's just another angry black man who can't control himself." That man lived his entire life wrapped in perfection, like a mask he was forced to wear. And sometimes, if you wear a mask too long, it becomes your skin. In the next part, we will follow the traces of the torn photographs, broken friendships and relationships he never mentioned by name. To understand why inside an abandoned house, Sidney Poitier left behind blank spaces no one dared to fill. The slashed photographs in the abandoned house. The abandoned house where Sidney Poitier spent his final years held no echo, no hurried traces of a star's life. It was filled only with dust, cold light, and a sense of disorientation, as if the space had once belonged to someone who wished to be forgotten. But at the center of the second-floor room, where signs were found that no one dared to explain, there was proof that Poitier had spent his last days locked in a silent war with memory. On the aged wall, photo frames hung in perfect rows like a gallery of remembrance. There were black and white portraits, faded Polaroids, and color photos from film sets. All of them captured moments of his glory. He stood beside Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, and Diane Carroll. But in nearly half of them, the faces of the people next to him had been slashed with a sharp object. They weren't ripped in anger. They were scratched slowly, one stroke at a time, as if the person behind it wanted each mark to serve as a punishment. One particular photograph lay face down in a wooden frame. When it was turned over, it revealed the well-known behind-the-scenes shot from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. But the co-star standing next to him had been completely erased. Only Sidney remained, staring directly into the camera, his dark eyes sunken, as if he already sensed something coming from behind. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. It said, "They promised not to betray me." But they did before I had the chance to walk away. A total of 37 photo frames were found with slashed faces. Some names that Sidney once mentioned in his memoirs had disappeared from his address book. Individuals who had marched beside him in civil rights events were suddenly never spoken of again. No one knew the reason, but all of them left behind the same impression. They had been erased. A former housekeeper recalled that whenever Sidney heard news about an old colleague being honored, he'd simply shake his head and step out into the yard. He would stand there for hours in silence. Once she overheard him mutter to himself, "I carried it for them all those years. And now they don't even say my name." It wasn't only friends. Even some of his closest family members gradually pulled away. One of his eldest daughters once wrote on her personal blog, "He was a father to the world, but never father to me." Though Sidney never publicly responded, he quietly removed her name from the original draft of his will. A handwritten note found in an old notebook read, "Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but silence lasts longer." The erasure wasn't just physical. It was something he seemed to do to himself to sever ties with the world that once lifted him up and pretended he had never existed. It was as if Sidney Poitier wasn't only forgotten by Hollywood. He also wanted to erase himself from the memories that had wounded him. There were no more tributes, no more shoulders to lean on, only slashed photographs, empty frames, and a room locked from the inside. Sidney Poitier betrayed his first wife. The romantic life of Sidney Poitier was a complicated journey. It was filled with controversy, guilt, and silences that were never spoken aloud. His first marriage to Juanita Hardy, which began in 1950, was once seen as a symbol of black love during a time of deep racial segregation. But after 15 years, they quietly separated, when the ideal image could no longer hold up against reality. In the early years of marriage, Sidney and Juanita struggled so much that they couldn't afford a $75 hospital bill. When their first child was born, he once recalled that moment. With tears in his eyes, he had to offer up their household belongings to cover the cost, even though just days earlier, he had turned down a role that might have pulled them out of poverty. The reason was simple. That role went against the moral values he had always stood by. Sidney, his daughter, would later share, "My mother never complained. She chose to stand by him even if that meant continuing to live in hardship." Juanita had no stage, no script, no lines to defend herself. She stayed in the background, the wife of a man the world praised, though she herself was no longer sure she held his heart. In the years that followed, as Sidney's fame grew, he was home less and less. His career exploded while their marriage slowly faded. Not because of arguments or hatred, but because one man brought the world into his hands and let go of one who had held his through the years of obscurity. On the set of Porgy and Bess in 1959, Sidney met actress Diane Carroll. Both of them were already married, but the feelings between them, as Sidney later admitted, were too strong to resist. They promised to leave their marriages for each other. Carroll followed through. Sidney did not, at least not soon enough. He confessed to Juanita that he had fallen in love with someone else, and that marriage ended not with scandal, but with the quiet exhaustion of trust. There were no tears during their parting, no screaming, no lawsuits, just two people standing silently across from each other, as if everything that once felt sacred had dissolved into an irreparable weariness. Sidney was not a liar, but he was a man too idealistic to live honestly when his heart had changed direction. And Juanita, the woman who quietly shared the hardest years of his life, left like a supporting character, erased from the final scene. His relationship with Diane eventually fell apart as well. Both were hurt. Neither found the love they thought they had, and Sidney once again withdrew into silence. It was not until 1976 that he entered into his second marriage with Canadian actress Joanna Shimkus. That chapter was entirely different. No noise, no pain, hidden beneath the surface. They lived together for more than 4 decades. Until his death, Joanna once described their love as a destined kind of peace, where no one had to prove anything. To her, he was not a legend. He was a kind, honest man, devoted to his family. He was 3 times better than people imagined. And he still made my heart flutter. Even with silver in his hair, she said. But even with a beautiful ending, the path to that peace was paved with mistakes, with moral and emotional choices that gave Sidney Poitier's life the shape of a man who always knew what was right, but could not escape being hurt. In a personal note, never sent, Sidney once wrote, "There are things I gave up for my ideals, and I lost someone who once believed I was her whole world." A tragic death. On January 6th, 2022, Sidney Poitier took his final breath. In his home in Beverly Hills, California, he passed away at the age of 94. Not under stage lights, not in the embrace of glory, but in the quiet exhaustion of a body too tired to continue carrying the weight of being a legend. According to the death certificate, the cause of death was heart and lung failure. But what had eaten away at him day by day was much more: Alzheimer's disease, which chipped away at his memories until he forgot even the faces he once loved, and prostate cancer, a slow-burning wound that brought pain in silence. In his final days, Poitier lived like a shadow, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost, at times asking about an old role, and other times believing he was still on set when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas confirmed his death. The world was stunned, and in that very moment, tributes began to pour in, as if trying to fill the space no one had reached while he was still alive. President Joe Biden called him an unwavering beauty, a man who opened the hearts of millions and changed the way America sees itself. Barack Obama praised him as a rare talent who carried dignity and grace. Michelle Obama Bill and Hillary Clinton all expressed their sorrow with a tone of deep and rare respect. Hollywood bowed its head. Martin Scorsese said he possessed a strength and grace that seemed beyond the limits of nature. His name was spoken by those he once inspired: Morgan Freeman, Viola Davis, Whoopi Goldberg, Lupita Nyong'o, Oprah Winfrey, Ava DuVernay, Jeffrey Wright, Quincy Jones. They called him the Trailblazer, the man who never bowed, the one who dared to be fully human when the world asked him to remain silent. On January 19th, Broadway dimmed its lights at 7:45 p.m. in his memory. A rare gesture reserved for souls that changed the way that stage breathes. Ibitfest, one of the most academically grounded film festivals, announced it would dedicate its entire program that year to Poitier's memory. But in the house where he took his last breath, those close to him said he did not pass surrounded by glory. He left this world as a man with pain, doubt, and unanswered questions. A small piece of paper was found beside his bed. On it, in faint handwriting, was a single line: "If I can no longer remember that I once lived, will anyone still remember who I truly was?" The death of Sidney Poitier did not merely close the chapter of a legend. It revealed the fierce fragility of a soul that had carried itself as a symbol. And in the moment he departed, the world finally began to understand. Sidney Poitier had not died. He had simply returned to being human. Wealth wills and the legacy left behind. At the height of his career, Sidney Poitier was one of the highest-paid stars in Hollywood. He earned as much as $1 million per film, an exceptional figure at the time, especially for a black actor. He was a box office guarantee, a national icon, a symbol of hope for millions of black people in America and around the world. But when he died in 2022, the numbers he left behind surprised many. Financial reports were inconsistent, estimating his net worth between $20 and $25 million. It was a substantial amount, but one that felt small in comparison to a legacy that spanned more than half a century. That number quickly became a point of controversy. Poitier did not release a public will. Some family members confirmed they had seen a draft, but no one knew which version was final. Some of his children felt left behind. Certain provisions were removed without notice. Several intellectual properties were not clearly assigned to any heir. In a handwritten note, never submitted legally. One sentence was underlined twice. They don't need the assets, they need to know. I thought of them. There were rare photographs never digitized, brand rights that had not been claimed, royalties from film licensing that were still tied up in undistributed funds. While the media honored him and the film world called him a bridge between two worlds within his own family, there were still empty spaces. When one of his daughters was asked about inheritance, she replied, "I don't need his money. I just wish he had said my name in the years I needed to hear it the most." A researcher once observed Poitier's legacy is not about wealth. It's about the sense that he never truly belonged to anyone, not fully to Hollywood, not fully to the civil rights movement, not fully to his family. Perhaps the real cost of a legacy is when you build something for humanity your whole life, but leave behind too little for the people who once called you father. And then the question is no longer how much did he leave, but how much of him was never held by anyone. A humanitarian legacy, the man who gave in silence. Throughout his legendary career, Sidney Poitier was not only a symbol of cinema and dignity, he was also a man devoted to his community through tangible action. In 1959, while still battling Hollywood's racial prejudice, he joined Harry Belafonte and Jackie Robinson to establish the African American Student Foundation. This initiative funded 770 scholarships for black students from 1959 to 1963, opening doors to higher education for those once denied opportunity solely because of their skin color. These were not just scholarships. They were declarations that knowledge is a right, not a privilege. Poitier didn't stop at education. He was an active force in the fight against AIDS at a time when the disease was met with fear and stigma. Through the AIDS Project Los Angeles, APLA, he helped raise awareness, support healthcare programs, and push for equitable policy. Alongside that, he partnered with AMFA, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, where he played a vital role in global fundraising and policy efforts. A cornerstone of this work was the annual Cinema Against AIDS Gala, which raised tens of millions of dollars for HIV/AIDS research and treatment. The event attracted world-renowned figures, such as Dame Elizabeth Taylor, Sharon Stone, Demi Moore, Elton John, and Sidney Poitier was always present, as if to remind the world that art and humanity are inseparable. But Poitier never boasted about what he gave. He did not need television cameras when signing a check, nor a spotlight to hand out a scholarship. He gave as though he was simply returning something to those left behind by history. In the realms of social justice, education, and cultural advancement, he quietly lifted the next generation. Someone once asked, "Why don't you put your name on a school or institute?" He simply smiled and replied, "If what I did helped, they'll remember it. If not, my name on a building won't change a thing." Perhaps that was the essence of Sidney Poitier, a man who lived not only for the roles he played on screen, but for the silent roles he played in life. His true legacy is not found in a golden Oscar, but in the lives he quietly touched, from a thin boy born into poverty in the Bahamas to the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. Sidney Poitier wrote a chapter not only in film history but in human history. Yet, as you've seen, behind the smiles on red carpets were silent cracks. Behind the righteous roles was a soul, constantly torn between ideal and reality. If this story has stirred something within you, a memory, a feeling, or a hidden part of yourself, please subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment below.